all to Warrane College at the University of New South Wales for the 2025 Warrane Lecture with Joseph Pearce. I'd like to start with some acknowledgements from the Bidjigal people who first walked on these lands and who remain the spiritual custodians of it, to our Anzac troops who also walked these lands and trained and camped here before marching down Anzac Parade to go off on their self-sacrifice journey to win, to fight for the freedoms that we enjoy today. The visionaries who started this university and indeed this very college, most notably our first foundational master, who was master for 24 years, the Reverend Dr. Joseph Bardens, who passed away earlier this year. Most of all to God himself, who brings us all together here and gives us the grace and wherewithal to be the custodians of this place currently. We pray that he who's truly present here in the college chapel will guide us tonight and remain close to us as he remains Warrane's longest serving, loving and most patient resident. I'd also like to single out tonight Warrane College alumnus and the founder and chair of Hertford College, Mr. Tim Mitchell. Where is Tim? There he is, right there at the front. Thanks, Tim. This night is where we have Joseph here because of Tim. So Tim met Joseph, I believe, at a conference in the United States and invited him on a speaking tour to Australia. I have no doubt that it is, in this current calendar year, Australia's most prestigious speaking tour. He will be off to Melbourne tomorrow. He'll be back here later in the week. And I do have to plug the main event, really, the Hertford College Lecture, which is Saturday at 6:30. Hertford College, the private school for boys just down the road here at Daceyville. So founded very recently in the last few years. And we are making a big plug of Hertford tonight because of the hard work that Tim and the team have put in to bring Joseph here to Australia. So there's some flyers outside. If you want to read more about Hertford, you can donate to Hertford. And if you like, you can attend the lecture there on Saturday night, 6:30 at Hertford College at Daceyville, where Joseph will be talking about a battle for a true education. He'll speak, a matter of life and death, the battle for a true education. We also have Salwa Elias out in the foyer. You might have met her before. She's selling Joseph's books, so you're very welcome to buy a book. And immediately after this lecture, while you will go through for refreshments, you can line up and have a book signed by Joseph. So please, at the end of the lecture, even though you all want a piece of him, don't grab him. I will protect him from you, and I will take him through there and sit him down the other side of the table. And as he's signing your book, you can pick his brain there as well as afterwards in the main dining room, where we'll have some supper and refreshments. So please, if you'd like to purchase a book, they're all out there on the table. We will get to Joseph's introduction in just a minute, but before that, some very mundane matters. The first is bathrooms, if you haven't found them already. The gents is at the end of the room, down to the right, my right, your left. Just go through there. There's also an accessible toilet a bit further along. For the ladies, it's immediately behind me, just off the foyer. In order to get there, please use the corridor that goes alongside this room, or to get out to the foyer any other way. So you access that corridor by the back of the room, or if you like, by the door halfway down. Part of that is just to not spoil the picture too much, because we have Warrane alumnus Lars Forsingdal, who is video recording this. So if you'd like to watch this back or share it with friends, it will be on Warrane's YouTube site in a few days' time. So please no running around in front of the camera and screaming and shouting, that would be great. Otherwise, act normal. The only time you will not be acting normal is if your phone goes off. So please just check now if your phone is on silent, or if you're technologically behind the play and find that the silent switch is hard to find at embarrassing times, maybe just turn it off altogether. If you hear other loud sounds, it could be our emergency evacuation sirens, which hopefully we pray we don't hear tonight. If we do, unfortunately, we're going to have to pause proceedings and move out of the college. So the front half of the room can go through the foyer and the front doors. The back half can go through that fire door right at the end of the middle of the room, and that will take us out to our emergency evacuation zone at the Village Green. Let's hope that doesn't happen. There will be a Q&A at the end of the lecture, so I'll go around the room with a microphone, and you just put your hand up and I'll come to you and you can ask Joseph a question. He'll remain here at the lectern. I just would like to remind people that it's a question and answer session, so we'll have questions, not comments. As I look around the room, I see many, many wise people who would have wonderful things to add, but we've paid some money, and Joseph has made a lot of time to be here tonight, so it's his wisdom we're looking for. So as you're formulating your question in your mind, please keep it brief and concise, and in that way we'll probably get through a lot more questions. So thanks for your cooperation on that. Then we'll have a brief vote of thanks, and then we'll have those refreshments in the main dining room, which is just on the other side of the foyer. So thank you all very much for coming. It's good to see a full room of guests and college members here tonight. I'd like to now call on the master of the college. This is our new master, who was just inducted at the beginning of this year, to formally welcome and introduce Joseph Pearce. So please put your hands together for Associate Professor Dr. Solzhenitsyn.
Thanks very much, Alex. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to Warrane College for our 2025 annual lecture. So the Warrane Lecture is an annual public lecture delivered by an eminent person from public life or academia. Its aim is to contribute to the understanding of important issues and current cultural challenges facing society, in line with the overall aims of this college. The Warrane Lecture is the highlight of the college's academic program. Many eminent Australians, as well as international public figures, have delivered the Warrane Lecture in its 50-year history. I think it is literally 50 years this year for the Warrane Lecture, because there are a couple of gaps in 1970 for whatever reason. I haven't quite worked out why that is, but so this is a very historic occasion. So among the eminent figures who've delivered this lecture are included two former Australian Prime Ministers, famous Catholic apologists like Frank Sheed, great churchmen, scientists, including the discoverer of the cause of trisomy 21, Jerome Lejeune, ethicists, very good, judges, and business leaders. We've also addressed a variety of topics in recent lectures, including international geopolitics and our place in Asia and the Pacific with General Peter Cosgrove, the role of authentic masculinity in today's society with former Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson, a debate on the voice to Parliament 2 years ago, and then a lecture on well-being and flourishing with Harvard Professor Tyler Vanderweel last year. So tonight we're going to hear from a British author and public intellectual, Joseph Pearce, who's perhaps best known as a champion of liberal arts education, and also a biographer of important figures in the Catholic intellectual tradition. It's very timely to have Joseph address us this evening. There's something of a revival of liberal arts education occurring in Australia at the moment. Small, independent liberal arts schools are popping up across the country, focused on giving their students a strong grounding in the great books while also fulfilling the requirements of state and national curricula. The Ramsay Centre for Western Civilization has established liberal arts courses in 3 major universities, and we have some Ramsay scholars with us this evening. Thanks very much for coming. And also, I might add, Warrane College has a vibrant philosophy club convened by yours truly. But there are challenges as well. Some of these are structural. The cost of attaining an arts degree at an Australian public university today surpasses $50,000, making it more expensive to pursue than most STEM degrees. This is a consequence of a government policy endorsed by both Liberal and Labor federal governments to provide increased state subsidies for areas of national priority. Some of the obstacles, however, are also cultural. Many young people struggle to read a book, yet alone a classic work of literature. The attention deficit experienced by many young people induced by frequent social media use makes it hard to sit down and patiently read a novel or a great work of philosophy or history. I've got some approving nods from the audience here, so I think I'm onto something. Well, Joseph Pearce is a person who, in different ways, is helping to address these challenges and helping to break open the great books for a younger audience. I actually attended a lecture at Campion College last night where Joseph did just that, speaking on the topic of God's love and great literature. It was a very good example, actually, of how great literature can help us to think through a question of vital importance, namely, what is true love? A native of England, Joseph Pearce is internationally acclaimed, and his books include the bestsellers The Quest for Shakespeare, Tolkien, Man and Myth, The Unmasking of Oscar Wilde, Wisdom and Innocence, A Life of G.K. Chesterton, and of course Solzhenitsyn, A Soul in Exile, which will be the topic of tonight's lecture. Joseph has also been involved in helping set up liberal arts schools across the United States and has produced a 13-part television series on Shakespeare. He is an editor of the St. Austin's Review, series editor of the Ignatius Critical Editions, senior instructor at Homeschool Connections, and senior contributor at the Imaginative, Conservative, and Crisis magazine. I don't entirely know how he makes all this kind of work and fits this into his schedule, but and also fits in a trip to Australia. But we're definitely very grateful to have you here tonight, Joseph. And Joseph's going to speak to us about specifically power, corruption, and the triumph of the human spirit. Can the West still learn from Solzhenitsyn versus Big Brother? Just as a final note, I'd like to note that Joseph Pearce actually met Alexander Solzhenitsyn at his home in Moscow in 1998. And he ranks this as perhaps one of the greatest honours of his life. Solzhenitsyn, A Soul in Exile is a tribute to the life and courage and heroism of Solzhenitsyn in the face of tyranny. And indeed, Solzhenitsyn almost 50 years ago delivered the Harvard University commencement address, A World Split Apart, where he controversially challenged America and the West for its decadent liberalism and capitalism. In this year's Warrane Lecture, Joseph will describe his meeting with the Russian dissident Solzhenitsyn and also the salient features of his life and works. And against the backdrop of major shifts in the international order, he'll also draw out some perennial lessons for our own time. So please join me in welcoming Joseph Pearce.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and I had no idea that I was following in such illustrious footsteps as someone giving this lecture. For instance, Venerable Warrane Lecture is someone I pray to daily. We have a son who has Down syndrome and autism, and so I pray daily to Venerable Warrane Lecture. And the fact I'm giving a lecture that part of the series that he gave, I can only think of a few words of Latin that we might know from the liturgy. Domine non sum dignus, Lord, I am not worthy to be in such illustrious company. So thank you for granting me the honour to be here to give this talk on Solzhenitsyn. So I'm going to take as a two-pronged approach to the topic of Solzhenitsyn and his importance to our own day. What would be called an objective approach and a subjective approach. So in the introduction, it was mentioned that I will be talking about my experience of meeting the great man back in 1998 and how it was I came to meet him and my impressions of him upon meeting him. But before that, I'd like to actually spend some time talking about who he is and why he's important. Now, for my generation, those who are as old as I am, and they get fewer and fewer every year, will remember him. And when I was young, there's certain, a newspaper photograph, you did not need a caption, right? Everyone knew what the person looked like, Elvis Presley, right? You didn't really have to write Elvis Presley under a picture of Elvis Presley because everybody knew it was Elvis, right? But another one was Alexander Solzhenitsyn. His facial image was so distinctive that you just saw the photograph and everyone knew who he was. He was a household name. His face was instantly recognized and recognizable. And it's part, if you like, of the tragic nature of our neglect of a priceless heritage, our contempt for the past, our cancellation of wisdom, that someone such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn is not as well known now as he should be, I suspect. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands who's heard of him before. I mean, you all come to this lecture. I would hope that most people have. But there might be some people that just, who's this fellow? I want to find out. So I want to ask a few questions to begin with. So these are well-known questions, rhetorical questions perhaps, but do great men make history? Or does history make great men? Or does history sometimes smother great men? As the great poet Thomas Gray shows in his poem Elegy written in a country churchyard. Some men, just because of their circumstances of their birth, were never able to fulfill their potential. Also, World War I, how many tens of thousands of great men lie buried and blown to pieces in mass graveyards on the Western Front and other parts of that field of war in World War I. So yes, the answer to all of the above is yes. Right? Do great men make history? Yes. Does history make great men? Yes. Does history sometimes smother great men, as Thomas Gray seems to imply? Yes. The Soviet Union smothered the lives of tens of millions of people, killed in the Gulag. Radical secular fundamentalism has killed tens of millions of people with what I call the 3 Gs. The denial of God leads to the guillotine, the Gulag, and the gas chamber. Many great men's lives were smothered by the guillotine, the Gulag, and the gas chamber before they were ever able to come to light and their greatness be ever known. Smothered by history. How the wisdom and mercy of God deals with that, I don't know. But I do trust in the mercy of God. Thanks be to God. Do great men make history? Yes. Alexander Solzhenitsyn proves it. Does history make great men? Yes. Alexander Solzhenitsyn proves it. And we can thank God that he was one who survived the great smothering of great men that the Soviet Union caused. Another well-known phrase we're going to carry on with now, Lord Acton's axiom, we might know that power tends to corrupt and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. The life of Alexander Solzhenitsyn throws light on all of these questions and helps us understand not only history and the nature of power, but our own times and the nature of man himself. Indeed, I would suggest that understanding Solzhenitsyn will help us understand ourselves and the time in which we live. So the first half of the talk will be looking at Solzhenitsyn's life, who he was, and why he's important. So who was Solzhenitsyn? And some of these that sort of headings I'm going to sort of throw out here, titles are from my book, Solzhenitsyn, Soul in Exile. So one of the early chapters is Child of the Revolution. So he was born on the 11th of December, 1918. Of course, the Bolshevik Revolution happened just over a year before that. Even the 9 months that he's in the womb were turbulent. His father died when his mother was only 3 months pregnant, so he never knew his father. And on the 5th of September 1918, so when basically he's 6 months in utero, the decree on the Red Terror called for the mass executions and authorized the new Soviet Republic to defend itself, quote, against its class enemies by isolating them in concentration camps. The beginning of the Gulag archipelago that Solzhenitsyn would expose several decades later. This was the world into which Solzhenitsyn was born. And there's a period of his life in which you might call blissful ignorance. He had memories of his mother's faith and the faith of his aunts. He has early memories of icons on the wall. But because of the state education system, which systematically, through mandated curricula, I'll say no more as regards applicability, he was brainwashed into atheism. At the age of 11, he joined the Young Pioneers, which we might call the Soviet equivalent of the Hitler Youth Movement. It's the youth movement of the Soviet Communist Party. He was a committed atheist. He had a desire to write an epic similar to Tolstoy's War and Peace, except the subject of this epic would be the glorious Bolshevik Revolution. And then he signed up to fight for the Soviet army on the Eastern Front during World War II. What he experienced as the Russians advanced through East Prussia horrified him. There's a very disturbing poem I recommend, but it's not easy reading, in terms of its content, called Prussian Nights. And this is Solzhenitsyn's account of the Soviet army's advance through East Prussia. Stalin basically told the Soviet army just to take vengeance on the Germans. So any German that was caught by the advance of the Soviet army, I'm not talking about soldiers, I'm talking about women and children, were butchered. And there is a rather graphic scene in Prussian Nights where, so I should say, by the way, that when I read my biography of Solzhenitsyn, we have to, this is written as if it's a personal memoir. It's actually parallels the Gulag Archipelago. Some of it is personal memoir, but it's also a composite collection of other people. When he was in the Gulag, when he was in the labor camps of the Soviet Union, he met many other people who had been on the Eastern Front with him, and he was collecting information because he was going to expose the Soviet Union. He was collecting all of this in his mind and memorizing it, eventually able to write it down and collect other stuff later. But a lot of this is just composite conversations he had with other people's experience. It doesn't necessarily mean he's there, but he's recounting things. He might have been there. He doesn't distinguish. It's all a sort of a single narrative. But he hears moans, and he's in this gutted house, and he goes in, and there's a middle-aged woman who's been blinded, defending her daughter, a child who had been systematically raped by who knows how many soldiers. The girl's mother had been blinded in her frantic efforts to protect her child. Her child's now dead. And the blind woman begs whoever it is that's just come into the room to put her out of her misery by shooting her. There's another story he tells of that Russians fighting in the German army, that now they're being taken prisoner, and knowing that their fate would be worse than death. And he witnessed somebody, with the narrative of the poem, said, witnessed one of them throwing themselves under the tracks of a tank to be crushed to death rather than face what they would have to face. And another one, I think this was autobiographical, but was begging him to intervene as he's being beaten. And he reproached himself for his cowardice in doing nothing. But quite frankly, he could have done nothing except get himself arrested. The situation was in. But how did Solzhenitsyn perceive this? This is Solzhenitsyn, the depth of the man. This was the first important and defining moment of his life, for which he thanked God. For Solzhenitsyn, the life-changing moments that led him closer to God all involved crucifixion, all involved suffering. Knowledge and wisdom comes through the experience of suffering. So that's the first important and defining moment, is his experience on the Eastern Front during World War II as a captain in the Soviet army. Then the second most defining moment is his arrest. So he commits the heinous crime against the state of writing a personal private letter to a friend, in which there are relatively mild criticisms of Comrade Stalin. Now, there's no such thing as private correspondence in the Soviet Union. All letters were opened and read. And for this private, mild rebuke to Comrade Stalin, he is subsequently sentenced to 7 years hard labor. How does Solzhenitsyn respond to this? Thank God for prison, he says. The chapter in my book is Arrested Development. His world collapses. All his hopes, his plans disintegrate. But his eyes are opened. He's no longer a believer in atheism. He's no longer a believer in Soviet communism because of his interrogation and torture that he experiences upon his arrest. His experience in the labor system show him the reality of the regime under which he is living. and he thanks God for the Enlightenment. Small price to pay to spend 7 years in hard labor if you're no longer living a lie and believing a lie. This is the man. This is the honesty and integrity and courage and endurance of the man. So his years in the Gulag Archipelago from 1945 to 1952. And there is the chapters in my book that cover this period are Hell into Purgatory, which is not actually an inappropriate title, because Solzhenitsyn entitles one of his books The First Circle, which is a reference to the Divine Comedy. The first circle of hell is where the virtuous pagans are. They're not going to go to heaven, but nor have they committed any crimes. The first circle of hell for Solzhenitsyn was because he was a mathematician, an intellectual. He was allowed out of the labor camp, which could have meant, the labor camp could have killed him. Working outside on construction in the Siberian winter on very meager rations killed most of the inmates. And he was liberated from that because he was a mathematician and sent to a much easier prison. He's still in prison, but he's now doing research. But he's doing research on technology, which early types of voice recognition technology, which would be used by the Soviet state to tap phone calls and detect the voice of the person using the phone calls. And at some point in conscience, he says, no, I'd rather go back to the labor camp. I'd rather go back to the depths of hell rather than the comfort of the first circle of hell, helping the devil himself. So he goes back to the labor camps, and that's hell becomes purgatory because he continues to grow spiritually. It's another title of a chapter of the book, Profit from Loss. And then he's released from, I'm not going to say too much about his work. There's a lot of it, such as the First Circle, there's a lot of autobiographical stuff. If you want to know something about Solzhenitsyn's life, you also read his novels. So it's the character of Gleb Nershin in the First Circle is basically Solzhenitsyn. And there's another very interesting character called Dmitry Sologdin, who was a friend of Solzhenitsyn he met in the prison. He's so that's the character, and this is a real-life depiction of someone called Panin. So again, I recommend his novels. And then just when he gets out of prison, you think this man's having a hard time, right? 7 years in prison, and just as he's getting out of prison, first he's not allowed back home to Moscow. He remains in internal exile in the middle of nowhere. But as he's released from prison, he is diagnosed with cancer, which is believed to be terminal. So he's just done 7 years in prison, and now he's going to die. And it's at this moment that he accepts and embraces Christ, that a close encounter with death brings him to life. The belief he's going to die leads to his resurrection. And in 1952, he becomes a convert to Russian Orthodoxy. It changes his life. There's a wonderful poem he writes about that, which I quote in the biography. And then there's a chapter called Beautiful Exile. So he's working as a school teacher in the middle of nowhere, can't go home, but he begins writing his books. He's basically, what he's doing is priming and planting time bombs, which are going to go off under the Soviet regime years later. So in the 1960s, shortly after Stalin dies, there's a very brief period. Stalin, clearly everyone lived in fear of Stalin, especially those closest to him. So very few people mourned his death. So there's a short period following his death when it was sort of permitted to criticize Stalin, not to criticize the Soviet Union, not to criticize Marxist ideology, but criticizing Stalin was okay. And it was at this time, because of this, that the Soviet Union permitted the publication of Solzhenitsyn's novella, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which depicts a typical life of a typical convict, a political prisoner in the Soviet labor camps. It's a huge success. But the Soviet Union realized very quickly that this is not just criticism of Stalin that's happening here, it's a criticism of the system. So soon the Iron Curtain of censorship comes back down, and Solzhenitsyn from this moment onwards is fighting a war of attrition for freedom in the midst of the Soviet Union. His other books, so The First Circle, Cancer Ward, plays such as Candle in the Wind. So again, there's a recurring theme in all of this. You know, what is life? Life somehow mystically is connected to the cross. So in the play Candle in the Wind, for instance, I don't have much time to talk about his works, but in his play Candle in the Wind, there's a character, a female character, and she's very highly strung. She's living a sort of very miserable life because of her, psychological condition. So the scientists use her as a guinea pig with the new techniques of neuroscience to understand the secrets of the brain. And they experiment on her, and at the end, the experiment is a success because she's no longer suffering, but she's also no longer living. She's become comfortably numb. I don't know if any of you know Pink Floyd. I have become comfortably numb. But you're no longer experiencing life. Okay, so this is Solzhenitsyn again being absolutely profound. And then, of course, he's writing his masterpiece in the midst of all this, the Gulag Archipelago, in secret. There's no chance of getting it published, so they're being typed up and copied the old-fashioned way, right? Copying manuscripts, medieval way. That's the samizdat. That's the only way you could publish, is get things hand-copied or typed up and different manuscripts being passed out. And these manuscripts were also being smuggled out to the West and published in the West. And the Gulag Archipelago, when it's published in the West, Volume 1 of the Gulag Archipelago, becomes a global bestseller. It exposes the dark reality of life in the Soviet Union. In 1970, Solzhenitsyn wins the Nobel Prize in Literature. He doesn't leave the country to make an acceptance speech because he's concerned that if he does, they won't let him back in. He has a wife and young children. But he sends the Nobel Prize acceptance speech, which is read, and actually is a fine essay. There's a new book out, actually, I can't remember what it's called at the moment. It's a new book out of Solzhenitsyn's speeches, come out in the last couple of months, which I recommend. I can't remember what it's called. And this is one of the ones that's included in that, the Nobel Prize acceptance speech. So around this time, so I wrote my biography of Solzhenitsyn in about 1998, shortly after I met him. It was published the following year, I think, 1999. He lived to be 2008. In the second edition, it was published after he died. I put a fact that I did not know because it had not been revealed when I wrote the first one. The KGB files were open. And they discovered that around this time, 1970, there was an assassination attempt on Solzhenitsyn's life, which I recorded in the second edition. And it's a new toxin that they thought if you just put it on the skin would actually sort of cause a sickness which would become fatal and to be untraceable. You would just get a mysterious sickness and die and nobody would know why. So Solzhenitsyn got very sick. And no one knew why he got sick, but he did not die. He was not smothered yet again. This, by the way, this technology was later used. I can't remember his name now. Some of you might remember if you're old enough. A dissident from an Eastern European country was stabbed in London with an umbrella. and that umbrella had this same toxin on it they used on Solzhenitsyn, but they just refined it enough. But also they knew you actually had to break the skin. It was not going to kill you topically, you actually had to penetrate the skin and the blood. So that's where they stabbed him with it, and he died a couple of days later. So this is the same toxin that was developed and used on Solzhenitsyn. In 1974, he was charged with treason. Now, because he's seen now as a hero, as a David figure against the Goliath of Soviet tyranny, the Soviet Union knew if they killed him, it would prove him right. So they're in a bit of an awkward situation now. So they charge him with treason, and he is exiled, expelled from the country with his wife and children. He spends a few years living in Zurich in Switzerland, and then he moves to the United States and spends the rest of the time while he's in exile from Russia, living in Vermont in the United States. 1978, he is invited to give the Harvard commencement address, which is referred to in the introduction. This is a defining text, by the way. If I want to know whether someone can be relied upon philosophically, politically, morally even, I asked them to read the Harvard address and let me know what they think of it. If they're critical of it, then I think they don't really understand some of the deeper issues. Because basically he says here, obviously they're just expecting Solzhenitsyn to stand up Harvard commencement address and sort of talk about the evils of communism, and everything about the West is wonderful because that's where freedom is. And he does stand up and say that the communism is evil and we have to fight communism. But he also says that the West has nothing to be proud of, that the decadence of the modern West is self-destructive, that we need to find a way out of our present situation. And then when Russia emerges from communism, by the way, he always had faith that the Soviet communism would collapse. Now, if you're as old as I am, the Cold War was seen as a stable situation, not a good situation, but a stable one. That basically the Eastern Bloc would be there for, not forever, nothing's forever, but decades and decades and decades. We'd all be dead before there's any significant change between, the NATO bloc in the West and the Warsaw Pact countries in the East, the Soviet Empire, we might call it, the whole of Eastern Europe. That there was a sort of Cold War impasse, that this was sort of stable. But Solzhenitsyn said, I will be home in a post-communist Russia before I die. He always had faith that this would be the case. And he said that when Russia emerges from communism, it should not follow the modern American model of decadence. And from that moment onward, the Western media turned against him. He became an enemy. So now this man, as he's been reviled by the Soviet Union, now finds himself a pariah in the West. He writes a wonderful book called Rebuilding Russia, which I thoroughly recommend, but basically he is in conformity. His ideas are very similar to the social teaching of the Catholic Church, as embodied in encyclicals such as Rerum Novarum, 1891, Leo XIII, Quadragesimo Anno, 1931, Pius XI, and Centesimus Annus, 1991, St. John Paul II. Where the Catholic Church's social teaching, social doctrine on the pillars of subsidiarity and solidarity are raised. It's also very similar to the ideas of G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc and distributism, or E.F. Schumacher's Small is Beautiful. And when I interviewed him, I said, this is very similar. I pointed out these similarities. I said, were you influenced by any of these people? And he smiled at me and said, no, I think it's just a case of minds coming together and thinking alike. But these included the fact that no society is going to ultimately survive and certainly will not be healthy without self-limitation. That ultimately we have to have selflessness at the heart of the culture, not selfishness. That at the heart of the culture has to be a Christian understanding of the necessity to lay down our lives for others, not expecting others to lay down their lives for us. That responsibilities preceded rights. That spiritual precedes the material. That a society composed and an economy composed of many small businesses is healthier than an economy composed of a small mega businesses or a small nationalized industries. That a healthy society is not where a few plutocrats, a few super rich control the economy, or the government controls the economy, but where as many people as possible are actually stakeholders by being, in some sense, productive owners of the economy. So he was rebuilding Russia. The Russia that emerges from communism has to embody these principles. All right, so that's takes us through to sort of Shakespeare. Shakespeare. Sorry, I talk about too many different people. Write about two different people. I'm sort of sorry. I want to now move to Solzhenitsyn's my own time with him and my own relationship with him. So the subjective aspect for the remainder of the talk. But I had a lot of bad ideas. But during this commute, I read Volume 1 of the Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. It was a life changer and a game changer for me. He became a hero from that time onwards. And for me, I then went off and discovered Chesterton and Chesterton's ideas. And then when I discovered Rebuilding Russia many years later, that was what rekindled my interest in Solzhenitsyn. It's about 1990 or something. And he was then back on my radar at that point. So I published my first biography, a biography of G.K. Chesterton, and I always say that, as Chesterton was the greatest influence under grace in my conversion, that my first biography, my first book was an act of thanksgiving to God for giving me Chesterton, and for Chesterton for giving me God. But then I discovered in this book, Rebuilding Russia, that Solzhenitsyn was better than I thought even. Not only was he a great hero in defying evil, he actually had the right sort of ideas for actually building an alternative to evil. So I don't know how I found his address. I don't know how I managed to communicate with him. These are all details that I just have no longer any recollection of. But I wrote him a letter. And I wrote him a letter saying that none of the previous biographies of him had paid due attention to the centrality and importance of his Russian Orthodox faith. And this is a sin of omission that he's rectifying, and I would like to write a biography of him where that the centrality of his Christianity would be at the heart of the story. And so having written this, I thought, now I've got to sort of give some, why would he take me seriously? So the only thing I had to go on, and I've written a biography of G.K. Chesterton. That was it. So I sent off this letter not expecting to receive a reply. And the best case scenario is that I receive a reply from Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Dear Mr. Pearce, thanks but no thanks. Yours sincerely, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And I would frame the letter with the autograph and put it on my wall and be very happy. And imagine my astonishment when he writes back saying, yes, I will grant you an interview. I should frame this, by the way. He had been treated so abysmally by the Western media, he had refused to give any interviews to Western writers at this point for about 8 years. So why on earth would he say yes to me? And the obvious, so I'm astonished. By the way, it has to be, obviously, he agrees that the previous biographies have not paid due attention to his Christianity. So here I am now. I go down to London from where I'm living in England with this letter from Solzhenitsyn. I go to my publisher, HarperCollins, and I go up to the whatever floor my editors were on, and I'll wave this letter in front and say, look what I've got here. I said, you have to give me a contract to write the book, and you have to give me an extra few £1,000 because otherwise I can't afford to go to Moscow. Right? They look at it, they're as astonished as I am, and say, sure. They're delighted. So I get the contract, I get the money, and I go to Moscow. I'm still puzzled, why me? It must be just this Christianity thing. So his son, Yermolai, one of his 3 sons, Yermolai, picks me up from the hotel in Moscow and drives me out to the Dachau, this sort of big house in the woods where he lives, an hour or so outside Moscow. And before Solzhenitsyn emerges, his wife takes me to another room and points to the top shelf, top bookshelf, where there is the Ignatius Press editions of the collected works of G.K. Chesterton. Now, as if I didn't already have enough to thank Chesterton for, right, my conversion, he's also my ticket to Solzhenitsyn. The absolute proof of Solzhenitsyn obviously thought anybody who's written a biography of Chesterton and understands the need to, the importance of Christianity is the right person to write the biography. So then when Solzhenitsyn walks into the room, looking like he always did in those pictures when I was a kid, it was, I was sort of went, sort of, I was reduced to fandom, lost, unable to speak for a while. And then I made a big mistake that could have been fatal. The first couple of questions I asked him were political. And he answered the first one politely enough. But the second one, he said, I thought this was not going to be a political biography. I said, it isn't, honestly. I just wanted to get a couple of questions. But anyway, things calmed down. We had the interview done. And the situation was, we're sitting at a round table. And I'm sitting here, Solzhenitsyn's sitting there, Yermolai, his son, is sitting there. Yermolai, of course, the boys are raised in the West, in Vermont. Yermolai, I think, went to Eton College, which, if I was speaking to an American audience, I'd have to explain what it was. I probably don't have to explain it was from an Australian. Well, I'm not going to anyway. He went to Eton, and then he went to MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, in a very prestigious school in the United States. So high school education in England and a good college education in the United States, and lived in the United States. Of course, his English is impeccable, right? Fluent. He's also fluent in Russian, because that's the language I always spoke at home. So what I would do, I would ask my question to Solzhenitsyn in English. Solzhenitsyn would look me in the eye, and I could tell he understood everything I said. He would then, and then Yermolai would translate to Russian. And then, Solzhenitsyn would speak to me, looking at me, speaking to me in Russian. I wouldn't understand a single thing he was saying. And then Yermolai would translate to me in English. And occasionally, Solzhenitsyn would say, yeah, that's not what I said. And would correct, Yermolai's translation. So Solzhenitsyn, I have no doubt, why would he have the collected works of G.K. Chesterton, for starters? I mean, if he couldn't speak English well. But clearly he speaks English well, but he wanted, his son spoke English better. And Solzhenitsyn, someone who's very precise, and if he's saying something, he wants the exact meaning and not a sort of slightly pidgin English version of the exact meaning said. So this was my time with him. But the other thing about it, a few things that really surprised me. The depiction of Solzhenitsyn was always that he's a stern, humorless Jeremiah figure, right? A prophet of doom, right? But don't expect to have a good time when you're reading him. Certainly, if you were to be with him. And yet when he's talking, he had this sort of, first beautiful china blue eyes. They're deceptively young for someone who at this stage is 79 years old. But there's a glint in the eye and a chuckle in the voice. He had a great humor, great sense of humor. Yermolai told me that he is a great mimic of celebrities and politicians, and he would mimic politicians and have the family literally rolling on the floor, laughing. It was so funny. This is not the Solzhenitsyn that we see, right? But I saw it in the glint in his eye, that sort of infectious chuckle that was often in his voice. Actually reminds me of Chesterton, that certain recordings of Chesterton, when he's giving talks, there's this sort of recurring chuckle in the voice. He's obviously enjoying himself and just being alive and being there. And one of my most powerful memory of my time with him was there's a time when we met each other's eye and held each other's gaze. And I said he has these really beautiful, youthful China blue eyes, almost sort of dancing on the surface. But as he had my gaze, I felt as if I was being sucked in, and I could perceive depths of suffering and experience and wisdom. And I thought, being amongst other things, a Tolkien nerd, even while this was happening, that I was meeting Treebeard from the Lord of the Rings. Those of you that know Lord of the Rings, I was saying this man, the Ent who's lived for millennia, who's got all of this experience of the past, that this one, the embodiment, personification of tradition with a capital T in his person. That's what I experienced. Now, of course, I don't know whether this is my subjective projection. My feelings towards Solzhenitsyn are such that when I'm meeting his gaze in this way, this is how I'm interpreting the experience subjectively, or whether it was objectively there. What I do know is that the experience was real, and the analogy that entered my mind was very appropriate. So before my biography of G.K. Chesterton was published, my past was so bad, it did so much harm through my hatred towards others and my bad writing in my past, that I remember praying before my Chesterton biography was published that if this one book was published, I would consider that I'd at least done something worthwhile in my life, that my life wasn't a waste and only consisted of negative consequences as regards the impact of my writing and my actions on others, that I would have done something worthwhile, and I prayed for that. And that book was published, of course, and now I've had over 30 books published, but the fact that Chesterton and the publication of that book on Chesterton also led me to meet the great Alexander Solzhenitsyn. So I'm going to finish with two things. First of all, to go back to Gandalf, back to Lord of the Rings, I should say. I mentioned Treebeard. I'm looking into his eyes, but Gandalf says, I better make sure I don't mess it up here. It's not the time that is given to us that matters, but what we do with the time that is given to us. There can be few people in the history of the 20th century that did so much with the time that was given to them, a time of great suffering, than Alexander Solzhenitsyn. But I want to finish with a little moral. 1948, Solzhenitsyn is in the labor camps of the Soviet Union, lying on his bunk bed. At the same time, back in the comforts of England, George Orwell is writing 1984. George Orwell warns of the dangers of Big Brother. But in George Orwell's fictional narrative, Big Brother wins. Winston Smith is crushed. Everything he loves, he loses. Absolute, total power for absolutism and totalitarianism. That's realism. But in a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. In the Gulag Archipelago, lying on a bunk bed, Alexander Solzhenitsyn vowed to himself he was going to bring down the Soviet Union. He began to compose a poem exposing the Soviet Union in his head, and learned several tens of thousands of words because he couldn't write anything down in his mind. He was going to defeat the Soviet Union. In reality, it isn't Goliath that defeated David. It isn't the dragon that defeated St. George. It was David that slew Goliath. It was St. George that slew the dragon. And it was Alexander Solzhenitsyn who slew Big Brother. Thank you.
Thanks for your presentation, Joseph.
Thank you.
Where does the Solzhenitsyn versus Big Brother debate relate now to the Venerable Fulton Sheen's claim that the West has Christ without the cross and the East has the cross without Christ?
That's a great question, and I love that metaphor. My response to that basically would be to say that all of us, East, West, North, South, all of us are on Golgotha, nailing Christ to the cross, also being nailed to our own crosses. The only difference is, are we the good thief or the bad thief? Do we hate our suffering, to despise our suffering, to become nihilists because of the badness and suffering in the world? Do we become cynical anarchists? Or do we accept and embrace our suffering, ask God to help us carry our crosses and grow it in the wisdom that leads to heaven, as Alexander Solzhenitsyn does? There is nowhere without the cross, and there is nowhere without Christ. We deny him at our peril, and we will be crucified one way or the other.
Thanks, Joseph. Dostoevsky, the other of the two great Russian writers, warned of everything that Solzhenitsyn in The Red Wheel is basically telling us how it came about in the end, but in The Devils and so on, Dostoevsky's warning of it. But Dostoevsky seems to have this flaw of misunderstanding Catholicism and an exaggerated Russian messianism that Solzhenitsyn seems to have avoided. And I'm just interested in your take on that. And also in the Red Wheel, he points to people like Stolupin and others where there were real chances that if things had gone a different way, we may not have had 1917.
Okay, a great question. As regards Dostoevsky, the first thing I'd like to say, there's a wonderful book I recommend called The Drama of Atheist Humanism by Henri de Lubac, where he talks about the bad ideas that shaped the 19th century and led to the horrors, including the Soviet Union, of the 20th century, the ideas of philosophers such as Auguste Comte, and obviously Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche. But so you have the sections on all of these bad people. Then there's a separate section on Dostoevsky. But Dostoevsky is not one of these atheist humanists that we can blame for what happened subsequent to the 20th century. He's the antidote to the poison. And what Henri de Lubac says is that in the novels of Dostoevsky, you see a prophecy of the evils of Nietzsche before Nietzsche himself had prophesied them. He saw what was coming and what it would lead to. So yeah, he's a great prophet, an absolute great writer. But as regards Solzhenitsyn's Russian Orthodoxy and is he different from Dostoevsky with respect to Dostoevsky's anti-Catholicism, it's very interesting. So I asked him, because he met, Solzhenitsyn he's in exile with Pope John Paul II. So I said, well, you know, what was your experience in meeting Pope John Paul II? And it was wonderful in some ways, but edgy. Because on the one hand, he was very grateful to John Paul II that he saw as one of the heroes that helped to bring down the Soviet Union. And obviously, you don't know the history when JP2 went to Poland the year after his election as Pope in a communist Poland and told the people, "Be not afraid." And that was the genesis of the Solidarity trade union movement, which brought down the Polish government, which was the beginning of the domino effect that brought down the whole of the Soviet Empire. We have that great saint, John Paul II, to thank for that, but with others, including Alexander Solzhenitsyn. But Solzhenitsyn said that when he saw the Pope, yeah, this is Solzhenitsyn, well, I'm going to tell the Pope a truth or two. So Solzhenitsyn said that, you know, rebuked not the Pope himself, of course, and he said that he said, well, I'll come to that in a moment. He said that the Catholic Church was absolutely wrong and acted in a heinous manner when it actually sought, in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution, to come to terms with the Bolsheviks, and in Solzhenitsyn's view, as a means of gaining inroads into Russia at the expense of obviously the persecuted and crushed Russian Orthodox Church. And St. John Paul II apologized on behalf of the church for those actions. But then Solzhenitsyn did say that he was a great man, and obviously had nothing but respect for St. John Paul II.
Thank you, Joseph, for your talk. I wonder, in your interview with Solzhenitsyn, did he share about his fear? Does he have fear during being prosecuted and in his trials and his in the forced labor? And if yes, how did he overcome the fear? Thanks.
That's also a great and profound question, and one I'm not sure I can answer. I will give an answer. I'm not sure it'll be an adequate answer. You know, there's something in Solzhenitsyn's work which I think is probably evocative of Solzhenitsyn as a person, where he seems to be fearless. If you read about his autobiographical aspects of him, he seems to be fearless. The characters in his novels that are sort of thinly veiled Solzhenitsyn autobiographical figures are fearless. Now, is that because Solzhenitsyn is fearless, or because he refused to acknowledge or talk about his fear? So that's why I say I'm not sure I have an adequate answer, because it's a great question I haven't really thought about. You know, but certainly Solzhenitsyn's persona was that, you know, that even if you have fear, this is my trying to rationalise what I've just said. I don't know how good it's going to be. That if you're St. George facing the dragon, or Beowulf facing the dragon, or David facing Goliath, right? Irrespective of what you feel, you don't show it. It's about defeating the dragon, defeating the evil. And I think that's Solzhenitsyn's approach, but of course that doesn't answer the question, you know, as to how much fear he did feel at those various times in his life, when he's got cancer, expecting to die, he's just been arrested, he's been tortured, his life's fallen apart, he's got a wife he might never see again. You know, to what extent there was fear. Then, of course there must have been, but he doesn't write about it.
Thanks very much, Joseph, for your presentation. I was just thinking, it seems to me that sometimes in Solzhenitsyn's work, the darkness is really clear and the light is really clear. It seems to me that in our present society, that's not as clear. And I was just wondering if you could maybe point out about where we could go with changing the present society.
Okay, that's a good question. I'm trying to work out whether I agree with you or not before responding. You know, I'm actually going to apologise to Tim here. Tim's been following me around for 2 days, and I've been answering lots of questions. And I'm aware, because I've been with myself for 2 days also, that I'm giving answers that he's heard 5 times already. So that I hope that you haven't, because make it new, yeah, make it fresh. No, you can go to sleep. You're tired. The reality at the root of everything is anthropology, who we are as human beings, right? And there are various ways we talk about, we made in the image of God, etc., etc. But the two old classical understandings of who we are, we're Homo viator and Homo superbus, answers everything and brings us back to Solzhenitsyn, actually. So Homo viator is who we are called to be, man on the journey, man on the quest, man on the pilgrimage, that our only purpose in life is to get to heaven. Our only purpose in life is to be united with God, ultimately in heaven. So our life is a struggle, a journey, a quest, a pilgrimage. We are Homo viator, but we're also simultaneously, always, inseparably, always Homo superbus, proud man. The man who refuses the journey, who refuses the quest, who refuses the pilgrimage, who wants to do his own thing and go his own way instead. This is the battle between good and evil. And Solzhenitsyn states, quoting basically Dostoevsky, that the battle between good and evil goes through the center of the heart of every individual man. In other words, each of us is a civil war. And if each of us is a civil war, human society will always be a civil war. And the homo viator, theologically, is humility. Homo superbus, pride, is the absence of humility. Communism is a manifestation of pride. Nazism is a manifestation of pride. The French Revolution is a manifestation of pride. Our sins are all a manifestation of pride. And what we need is the exaltation of the humble, beginning with exalting the humility of ourselves by being proud of ourselves. That was a joke, by the way.
Joseph, this is my second question of the day. Thanks very much for the Bridgeford Fellowship this morning. With your experience suffering bringing you to Jesus Christ, when you were interviewing Solzhenitsyn, in terms of his suffering, were there quite a few new things that you found in terms of his suffering to Christ as well?
That's a good question, actually. Were you asking whether it's about my own personal suffering and how it led me to Christ? Was that part of the question? Yeah. So I suppose that if you read books that I wrote before I wrote to Solzhenitsyn, such as the Chesterton biography and especially perhaps Literary Converts, these lines from a priest character in a novel by who's here, by the way? We'll ask a question now. Who here has heard? I don't know how Australians pronounce. But let me find out. So I'm an Englishman who lives in America. So coming to Australia makes me curious. The name, the Christian name, Maurice. How would you pronounce that? Maurice. Yes! That's how I pronounce it. So the English pronounce it. In America, it's Maurice, right? So I say Morris Baring. No one knows who I'm talking about. Oh, you mean Maurice Baring? No, I mean Morris Baring, right? Anyway, there's this novelist, a great friend of G.K. Chesterton, Hilaire Belloc, and there's a wonderful painting you might have seen in the National Portrait Gallery in London. It's called The Conversation Piece by Sir James Gunn, and it's got G.K. Chesterton seated at the table, and behind him is standing Hilaire Belloc and the other figure we might know is Morris Baring. Many of us have heard of G.K. Chesterton, many of us have heard of Hilaire Belloc, few of us, I suspect, have heard of Morris Baring. Between the two world wars, he was a best-selling novelist. Profoundly Catholic, a convert to the faith, greatly admired as a novelist, and it's very successful. He got Parkinson's disease, so his writing career and his life died young. On the subject of suffering, actually, he wrote a wonderful poem called My Life is Like a Broken Toy, which nobody can mend. It ends with my life, my life is like something which nobody can mar. But anyway, in one of his novels called Darby and Joan, there's a priest character, and the priest character says, the acceptance of sorrow is the secret of life. When you understand that, you will understand everything. And that certainly haunted me, because that was a large part of what I discovered from my own suffering. And I think one of the reasons I love Solzhenitsyn is his whole life, if you like, is a parable or an embodiment of how we can grow and defeat the most powerful evils if we are prepared to accept suffering, which is, the Christian term for that is taking up our cross. If we are willing to take up our cross, we can defeat the devil. If we're not willing to take up our cross, we can't defeat the devil. So that understanding, acceptance, suffering, I think, is embodied in the example in the life of Alexander Solzhenitsyn.
Thank you, Joseph. You may already have partially answered this question with the issue of lightness and dark, but you may be aware that on the weekend we had a federal election in this country, and a particularly tyrannical, in my opinion, government was re-elected, and one of the cornerstones of their political agenda is a bill called the Misinformation and Disinformation Bill, which will empower government-appointed apparatchiks to define the truth. Now, I know it's a bit of an abstract question, but I'd like to know your opinion of what Solzhenitsyn would think of that and what advice he'd give to people who find themselves under such a regime.
Yeah, well, a good and suitably controversial question. It's there, because if you defeat it there, if you're growing in sanctity, you are going to be a witness just by who you are to those around you. Those around you will be changed by who you are. But themselves then will change others who are around them, and this is the domino effect of saints in society. So we have to begin here to defeat whatever label you're giving for pride. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity, and thank you so much for your talk, Joseph Pearce. I think there's a lot to unpack, and a lot of great men, which you spoke about, and some key ideas that I tried to, I suppose, summarize what I got through this incredible lecture. And I'll just start with the first one. You spoke a lot about the tyranny of the three sort of atheist regimes of the last 200-300 years, the guillotine, the gulag, and the gas chambers. And Solzhenitsyn's incredible way of seeing how those viewpoints have affected all the sufferings of the last 2 centuries. But what I found most interesting is how ultimately that was taken down by such humble figures. You talked about Solzhenitsyn himself, and particularly about how he was disillusioned through so much of the suffering that he saw in his experience in war. And also of figures like John Paul II during the Solidarity movement. And I think I definitely, my mother was born in Poland during those communist years, and growing up I heard a lot about all of the experiences of queuing up in lines for food. And I think that perhaps what Solzhenitsyn was trying to get at is that we in the West have become quite numb, as you said before. We've become numb to all of the difficulties and challenges that do exist in this life and that will always exist in this life. And perhaps we're kind of distracting ourselves from those things and living in comfort. So to tie that together, Solzhenitsyn's life showed that ideas have power and that they live on, and that no matter how much Big Brother he faced, ultimately good wins throughout all of that. And your own opportunity in your lifetime and the career that you've forged for yourself following your rough childhood. I did actually do a bit of research on what exactly that pertained beforehand. And I think the key inspiring thing there is that it was an encounter with Chesterton and ideas in a great book, and then all of the sufferings and experiences of your childhood that led you to forge that career. And none of that would have happened without an encounter with two things, both great ideas and with great suffering. So I think this is something perhaps that my generation and that anyone at this college can learn, that both experience and ideas, great suffering, are needed for humanity, perhaps to get a little bit closer to God and to understand what it is we're living for and to have a fulfilling life. So if I could conclude with anything as a student here, some of my greatest memories have been some of the incredible chats and conversations that have occurred after a formal dinner, late at night in the common rooms, over a drink or two. And so on that note, we'd like to provide you with a small parting gift as a memory of this college and for leaving us with so much to debate for so many days. Thank you.